Okay, thank you very much. And very grateful last week to the Department being there for a lot of clarification over many matters, and it's good to hear that some things will be tidied up. I want to keep my argument, so I'm actually not going to take any more interruptions. If you work through this piece of legislation, which abolishes our education and library boards and 3 other bodies, and sets out the roles for the new Education and Skills Authority, this bill seems to tick many boxes, and it purports to give power to the boards of governors and trustees to allow their schools to maintain their ethos and really manage their own schools. That all seems very, very good, but I can see no less than 8 different occasions, and I'm sure there are many more, where the Department seems to be able to overrule, override, or force change through if it really wants to. And that is why today we are opposing this bill. I'd just like everyone to consider for a minute that if we put all this legislation in place, with all the extra legislation, regulations and guidance, and we were told earlier that there's some 11 pieces to come through, in a few years, we could have a complete change here around in politics, and education could fall into the hands of a manic-driven, crazy fanatic, and he or she could set about destroying could set about destroying all the schools to her or his agenda. It's not a pretty thought, but I just want to make that as a point. Our job in the Assembly is to get it right and to get the legislation right. And that, Mr. Speaker, is why we're opposing this legislation. In the meeting with the Minister that the committee chair and I received 2 weeks ago, where I raised my concerns that we seem to be giving too much power to the Department, and I'm very grateful for the meeting, but you might not ask me back after this. In his reply, the Minister indicated that he envisaged the tribunals being very busy in the early stages of implementing this legislation. Now, on reflection, and the more I thought about it, it began to horrify me. The Minister is actually envisaging many battles. Why? And the more I thought out, does that mean there's a lot we've got to be careful about in this bill? And that reinforced my concern.
Would the member give way?
No, I said I wouldn't, but that's a test. I have indicated that I feel the Department is too powerful, and yet this is the hardest matter to illustrate in such a speech as this, when a bill is so complex. If we consider the employment schemes, i.e. the schemes laying out who's to be employed by the school, which the Board of Governors and or the trustees must submit to ESA, it is not just ESA who will be checking this. On deciding who to employ, there are 4 different clauses. One saying the Department may issue guidance, another that statutory requirements must be complied with, another saying that revised schemes may be produced by the Department if required by it, and yet another saying that, this is clause 9, the Department may require ESA to reconsider. So there's just 4 examples of a department having maybe too much power, 4 different ways that Sinn Féin can follow their own rules. And if we go on further, if you actually think of the appointment of ESA, the chair will be appointed by the department, and it's very possible that at least 9 out of the other 20 members may all be on one side, should we sadly end up taking sides on this, which of course we have at the moment. And yet, on top of all this, approval is needed by the Department from OFM, DFM, if they wish to issue guidance on provisions on these schemes. So if it's not agreed there, then it can go to a tribunal appointed by OFM, DFM. So if you think about it, not even the First Minister really agrees with the powers we're putting through it, as he, I assume it was him, has insisted that the checks come back to his office. So we're back to a carve-up and share-out that is typical of OFM DFM, where Sinn Féin, I may remind everyone, has equal power. And it's equal power to set the rules, set the procedures, and in this case appoint the judges and the jurors. Now I hope the House sees why I'm so sceptical. And this was only concerning employment schemes, and yet we've not covered schemes of management and many other areas laid out in the bill. If we look at the tribunals, who appoints the tribunals? Again, up at OFM, DFM. And we've already seen how appointments may all follow down one side of who supports who. And I'd like to raise a question: who will actually pay for those tribunals? Because the schools themselves will not have the funding. But Mr. Vice Principal Speaker, I want to move on to other matters. If we move on to area planning, this piece of legislation provides for ESA to prepare or revise area plans, which, as we all know, are an essential part of the organisation of schooling. And yet we're in the middle of a tortuous area planning process for both post-primary schools and soon for primary schools, where no meaningful consultation has happened, where no overall plan seems to exist, and where rumour and fear rule the roost. This bill indicates that ESA will deliver such a bread and butter process as area planning. And yet, I go back to reinforce the point, there is no overall plan that we can see. And yet it should be concentrating on what is in the bill, achieving the best education for our children. Can I ask the Minister for not just a long-term strategy, but for an overall plan in area planning? And I wonder, does one exist? I'm going to carry on. Could we actually have consultation with teachers, staff, boards of governors, parents, and maybe even the pupils themselves? At the stakeholder meeting held 2 weeks ago, the message was clear. The education bodies really do not know what is going on. No communication plan exists, and no one knows of this overall plan. And yet, we're meant to be in the middle of a consultation. It does, I fear, seem to be a bit of a farce. Regarding ESA, it was consulted on in its previous form 6 years ago. Much has happened since then. Nearly half the children will be new to it, and another similar group will have left. And many in education will have changed or moved on, and many of the facets of our education system, which, as we all know, have been inundating the schools, have also changed. Will the Minister carry out a proper new consultation? In fact, will the Minister lead the way and create a new method of a consultation, one that really reaches everyone, not just by email, not just to school principals, and not laced with jargon? We want one that informs, explains, and listens before it decides. Our area planning seems determined to entrench our divided education sectors as maintained schools joined with maintained and controlled with controlled, and so on. Is that the shared education our programme for government envisaged? Whilst on the subject of sectoral bodies, it is excellent to see that we have a sectoral body for the controlled sector. And good to know that we have one, although it's not in the bill, for the maintained sector. And we have a sectoral body for the integrated sector, but not in the bill. And yet we have no sectoral body for the voluntary grammars sector, unless GBA becomes it, in which case it needs to be funded. We cannot have good legislation with so many inconsistencies. Will all sectoral bodies be put into this bill, and will they all be funded? If I can move on to the transferring of employees. This bill allows for all the employees of the 8 bodies to be combined under ESA. A great idea, but has anyone costed it? It looks like the gold plating of the teaching unions. Just think of all the different rules and pay levels in every organisation, and the endless capacity that will exist to compare and raise pay and to equalise pay. And yet I must say that the unions are very important and part of the system, but we are opening ourselves up to an excessive cost. Has anyone actually looked at this cost? It also seems that the maintained system may still be able to avoid the fair employment legislation. and yet the rest of us must follow it. Is it true that the maintained employees are not to be transferred? We need consistency in all sectors and the same rules for all. Mr. Vice Principal Speaker, when it comes to local management, we all appreciate the benefits of having one body, such as ESA, and welcome the slimming down and the economies of scale. But we also know the differing needs of various parts of Northern Ireland. Fermanagh has different needs from Antrim, and both of them differ from Belfast, although neither of them come near to Antrim as being a great place to live. And we are also all aware of the needs to preserve our communities and, to an extent, rural-proof any changes in education. The department has indicated that it will have local offices. What will the cost of those be? Where will they be? And just while we're there, Mazarine is available in Antrim. We were told that ESA would save 40 million. Will it? And I wonder, when we look at the costs coming through pay and the costs through offices. But anyway, food for thought. Mr. Vice Principal Speaker, when it comes to inspections, the bill plans to allow inspections to inspect on any matter they feel is necessary at any time and report in any manner the department feels suitable. That, to me, is quite terrifying. We already have school principals under appalling pressure with the present system, and now we're trying to pile on more pressure to an already overloaded system. The Chief Inspector assured me that the Inspectorate is independent, and yet its employees are appointed by the department, and the standards are set by the department, and all the reports go to the department. And now we have in the bill lay people, a panel of lay people, to be appointed by the department, all to be part of the inspection system. Again, it smacks of too much power in Sinn Féin's hands in the department. We all must recognise that we have the highest standards of education and of professional practice, and we need inspection to put it in place. But the Inspectorate must get its own organisation and get its act together. It must create a more comfortable assessment system of teachers. It must not destroy its evidence. It must have no preconceived ideas of the schools and its actions it will take when it gets there. And it must be transparent at all times. But I go back to the beginning of what I said on inspection. It must be totally independent. If we look at the assets within the schools, we see that CCMS is to hand all its assets to ESA. And yet I can't quite get my head round exactly what is going on here. We have helped finance the whole of the maintained system so that it's in good order, and are now handing it over to ESA. Are we compensating the church or the churches? And indeed, are we going to spend the same amount of money on the controlled sector or the integrated sector, as we certainly seem to be spending a great deal on the Irish language sector? As in area planning, it does seem to be a sectarian carve-up, and here we see it being hinted at all over again, with the controlled sector as the poor, poor cousins. At the beginning of the bill, there is a clause in it, clause 2.5, which, if you read it, could be read in such a way that all grant-aided schools should be encouraging and facilitating the development of Irish speaking. Depends how you read it, but that is the sort of point that is wrong within this bill, and we need to get clarified. The bill also gives ESA a commercial role. I would like the Minister to tell us more on what he means by that. Is that just the nice bit of boarding and advertising around our sports pitches, or is it something allowing it to raise more funds through advertising, through other commercial ventures? We need to know more of exactly what it's opening us all up to. Now, you probably all agree with this. I've gone on long enough. Only another page. But may I remind you all that if the boot was on the other foot, would you want this legislation in place in the form that it's coming forward today? We know that Sinn Féin don't like grammar schools. We know that Sinn Féin don't like the power of the church, and to some extent it seems the maintained sector. We know they don't like the voluntary grammar sector. and they don't like the Dixon plan. In fact, if anything is good and is successful, somehow they don't seem to like it. Mr. Speaker, we do need this bill, but there is much more we need, and we've got to get it right. We need a proper long-term strategy, an agreed long-term strategy, and policies and plans that all fit together. And especially if you think about them, we have ongoing at the moment the entitlement framework coming in, common funding formula being reviewed, special education needs legislation, the new assessment system coming on board, area planning, as I've mentioned, GCSEs and changes to that being reviewed, and looming behind it all, the spectre of a cross-border dimension. I put it to all of you in here. This bill is a licence for Sinn Féin to destroy our education system. Is that what you want? It's not what the Ulster Unionist Party want. We oppose the bill.